Hello, this video is about consequentialist approaches to ethical issues. I'm Avram Hiller. I'm a member of the philosophy department at Portland State. And consequentialism is one of the main approaches to ethics and policy. And I myself have co-edited a book about consequentialism and environmental ethics. And some philosophers think that consequentialism is the only correct approach to ethics and policy. I won't try to convince you of that here, but you should know that philosophers and others have really done a lot of work in applying consequentialism to a lot of topics. So what is consequentialism? Consequentialism is a group of ethical theories according to which the rightness or wrongness of an action or policy is determined entirely by the consequences or perhaps by the expected consequences of the action or policy. So the most famous form of consequentialism is utilitarianism. And that was first explicitly formulated, by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th and early 19th century. It is also anticipated by Moist philosophy, followers of the Chinese philosopher Moza in the 19th century before the Common Era. And there's a video by Julia Markovits, who's a professor at MIT, with a very good explanation of utilitarianism if you wanted to follow that link. Now, classical utilitarianism, which is the utilitarian of Bentham and his follower John Stuart Mill, says that an act is right insofar as it promotes the greatest overall good or utility for the greatest number of individuals in the long run. And there are two things going on there. First, there's a theory of right action, which is maximizing consequentialism. And the maximizing part says that the action is right insofar as it promotes the greatest overall amount of something good. That's the maximizing consequences. But then we also need a theory of what is good, of what the utility is. And so Bentham provides that kind of theory. So what is utility? According to Bentham, it's the most pleasure and the least pain. And we need to work through some of the details about how to do that ratio, and I won't go over that in this video, but there is a lot of work done within utilitarianism to try to figure that out. Now, just to replace that in the original formula, I think Bentham's version goes something like this: an act is right insofar as it promotes the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number of individuals in the long run. And it's sometimes known as the greatest happiness principle, because we can think of the greatest ratio of pleasure over pain as simply being the greatest amount of human happiness. Now, what's not in the principle of utility? I think you can look at the meaning of a principle not just by what it includes, but also by what it excludes. And there's no mention in that principle that what matters is the happiness of only males or of people of a certain race or class or even of humans. An act is right insofar as it produces the most pleasure and least pain, regardless of whose pleasure or pain it is. And followers of Bentham in 19th century England helped push through reforms in voting rights, women's rights, rights of the poor, rights of prisoners, and rights of children to education. It was a really very revolutionary idea in 19th century England. Not everything that utilitarians did in 19th century England and beyond has been uncontroversial. There's a very long history that can be talked about utilitarianism, but it was a fairly revolutionary idea, and Bentham realized this as he was writing. Okay, now if we were to think of utilitarianism as a bumper sticker, now you might have seen this bumper sticker out there: practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty. I think the utilitarian version of this bumper sticker would be something like this: practice non-random, well thought out acts of kindness and sensibly maximize expected utility. So don't leave it up to chance that you act in a beneficial manner towards the rest of the world. Really think out in advance how to maximize expected good for the world. Okay, now there are other kinds of consequentialism. I mentioned that consequentialism is a group of ethical theories, one of which is utilitarianism. So consequentialism, as a reminder, says that we ought to be concerned about the consequences of an action. So one view is prioritarianism, which says that an act is right insofar as it maximizes welfare or well-being, but in which the welfare of the worst off is prioritized. So for consequentialism, every single unit of pain and pleasure counts equally, but for prioritarianism, what matters more is the welfare of the worst off first. Another form of consequentialism is eco-consequentialism. An act is right insofar as it maximizes ecological value. And so that's something, because I'm interested in environmental ethics, that I've been doing some research about. So rather than just caring about the ratio of pleasure over pain, I'm interested in, say, ecosystems flourishing. And I don't think that ecosystems experience pleasure over pain, but we still might be interested in maximizing the flourishing of ecosystems. And a lot of people nowadays apply consequentialism to non-human animals. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. Now, consequentialism is often contrasted with deontology. According to deontological theories, there are some ethical rules that apply directly to actions. So for instance, the 10 Commandments is one kind of deontological ethic. The 10 Commandments says, thou shalt not murder, period. It doesn't say, thou shalt not murder, except insofar as murdering in that particular case that you're interested in maximizes overall utility in the long run. So the consequentialist wants you to look at the overall consequences of every particular action. So another kind of example, some animal rights activists believe that medical testing on animals is always morally wrong. There's some kind of deontological rule that says that medical testing on animals is always morally wrong. However, some consequentialists might say that if some specific medical testing on some animals helps the most overall individuals, then it is permissible. If we were to be able to do a medical test on, say, 100 mice, and by doing that, we could find the cure for cancer, which would help many, many millions of people, then that's morally permissible to do that. So the one thing is that one does have to look broadly and wisely at the long-term consequences. So maybe in conducting one animal test, that would make it easier to do lots of other animal tests, or might even encourage people to do lots of animal tests. And even in cases where the consequences aren't so easily seen. And even in medical testing in advance, it's hard to tell that by doing this one medical test, you would find the cure for cancer. It's not a very realistic example. So the consequentialist really does want you to look very carefully and wisely at the consequences of your actions. Now, here is an ethics bowl case, and I will pause if you want to hit pause on your own to look at this case. It's from the case set from 2019-2020, and I've given the web address there. Okay, so I'm not going to go over in this video all the details. I'm not going to read it, but I will just go over it generally and then describe how a consequentialist might approach this case. So this is a case where there's an individual, Kayla, who was asked to be the advisor of the environmental club. And Kayla regularly teaches environmental ethics. And the one thing is that Kayla at home doesn't lead a very environmentally sustainable lifestyle. She has 2 minivans, etc. So what should Kayla do? Should she choose to be the advisor to the environmental club? And also, does she have a duty to tell her students that she engages in all of these environmentally unsustainable actions? Now, here are my thoughts on this case. So it does seem like probably it's the right decision, but it depends on who else might advise the club. If Kayla has the knowledge to advise the club well, then her personal behavior doesn't matter that much. So the benefits of someone knowledgeable advising the club really can have a lot of positive consequences. She could probably do a good job teaching the students about the environment, and that itself could have a lot of positive consequences for the environment if the students themselves then go on and do really good environmental things for the world. Now, there is this big question about Kayla's hypocrisy of preaching something that she doesn't really practice on her own. And the consequentialists will probably say that that hypocrisy in and of itself doesn't make that big of a difference. Now, it could make a difference insofar as she gets found out, and then it might delegitimize her teaching. And so should she tell her students about her behavior? Well, maybe not, but here's what it might depend on. It might depend on how likely it is that she would get found out. If there's like zero chance that she would get found out, then maybe she wouldn't have to worry about it. Although if it were to like gnaw away at her, then that might make her a less effective teacher or advisor. So what the consequentialist wants you to do is think about the consequences. But if there's a good chance that she would get found out and then that would delegitimize her, then maybe she should tell her students and just be honest about it. And maybe that would make her a little bit less effective, but at least she would be open and honest with her student. If it would make her such a less effective teacher, because people are somewhat concerned about hypocrisy, then maybe she should yield the position to somebody else. So it's not like a clear-cut case, but probably knowing, what I know or what reasonable people can assume about cases like this, it's probably okay for Kayla to have the position. And depending on how likely she is to get found out, maybe she should tell her students, but maybe not. Now, how does she compare to somebody else? Well, it depends, of course, on the other person, but probably she'll end up doing a better job than that other person. Now, here are some general suggestions for applying consequentialism to ethics bowl cases. So first, think about context. And consequentialism is highly context sensitive. So on a deontological theory, maybe you might say that stealing is always wrong. But for consequentialism, you could think of a case where, in most cases, stealing is wrong, but there might be some case in which, in this context, if there's really no harm to anybody, and then if it can do a lot of good in this one particular construed context, then maybe it is okay depending on what the consequences are. So you really have to think highly about context in thinking through a consequentialist view. Second, you have to think about all the stakeholders involved in the short and long term. So because consequentialism is a very inclusive kind of ethical theory, it really cares about all the individuals who are at stake in the long run. So do think wisely about the long-term future in thinking through from a consequentialist perspective. Don't put too much attention on people's personality or virtue. So it wasn't Kayla's hypocrisy that made a whole lot of difference, except insofar as maybe that had other consequences. What you should do is pay more attention to the results of the action or policy itself. And don't put too much attention on whether the action or policy is right in general. Think about whether it's right in this particular situation. But do think about the long-term effects of doing something that's generally not good or done by a bad person. And I think what often happens in ethics bowl cases, and this is why ethics bowl is, I think, a really great thing and really gets people to think in a complex manner about ethical situations, is that they often are cases in which they make you think deeply about a kind of case where some general ethical principle might have some complexities that maybe make the general principle not really apply well. And so, or make a bad person end up doing the right thing. And so I think the consequentialist perspective is a really interesting one to bring to bear to ethics bowl cases, because the consequentialist wants you to think really hard about the pros and cons in the long run, and not just focus on the action, it being right or wrong, in a simple manner. And think about alternatives. If there are no good alternative actions or policies, then even if an action seems bad, it might still be the right action or policy. So the consequentialist says, choose the one that maximizes overall good. And last, don't expect that answers to tough questions will always be clear-cut. Often there are considerations on both sides that weigh against each other, and it'll be hard to compare the sides. And that's okay. You can even say that it's a close call. One thing with Ethics Bowl, given that you get the cases in advance, you can do some research about the facts, but sometimes the details of the cases that you aren't given, that you can just kind of assume might make the difference between whether the decision is right or wrong. And it's perfectly okay to say that in your ethics poll answer. If the facts of the case are like this, then I would say this is the right answer. But if the facts of the case are like this, then this is the right answer. For the consequentialist, everything involves a weighing of the sides. So that is all that I have to say in this video, and thanks very much for your attention. Again, I'm Avram Hiller.